Hi, so this is a video where we're going to look at, well, the first of two videos actually, where we're going to look at the contrasting reactions of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth to the murder of Duncan. Okay, so this is Act 2, Scene 2, and the regicide of Duncan has just occurred off stage. Now that's interesting. Firstly, we think the play was commissioned for a state visit of King Christian IV of Denmark. I might just need to check whether he's a Christian with a C or a K actually. He was the brother of James I's young wife Anne. So when this play would have been performed, there would have been two kings in the audience. And also considering the recent gunpowder plot, think about what the impact of the regicide, how committing regicide is presented, the impact that is presented on Macbeth. And so potentially we have a sign of respect there from Shakespeare in putting the regicide off stage, but also in how he presents this traitor. So that's the first interesting point I just wanted to raise to you. The second thing which I just want us to briefly talk about is the idea of hands, which we're going to have a look at briefly in Macbeth's reaction to the death of Duncan, but also more predominantly in Lady Macbeth's reaction. And hands are quite interesting across the entirety of the play, not just in Act 2, Scene 2, and we'll have a little look at that when we get back into the classroom. We have hands at the start in Act 1 associated with loyalty and disloyalty, and both in Macbeth fighting with the witches as well. We have hands associated with guilt. We also have hands being seen with justice. So in Act 2, Scene 2, we're going to particularly have a look at hands in relation to guilt. So guilt is our kind of key emotion that we're exploring. And I also want us to think about the power between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. So let's have a quick look at the first chosen clip. So this is from Macbeth. He's talking about the guards who he has planted as the murderers, and he says, one cried, "God bless us," and amen the other, as they'd see me with these hangman's hands, listening their fear, I could not say amen. And then again he repeated, but wherefore I could not pronounce amen. So we've got this repetition of a lack of amen. So Macbeth is unable to say amen. And if we think of amen, it means, so be it. It's an agreement, and it's generally a conclusive word or response to a prayer. So that's quite interesting, the idea that Macbeth's unable to finish off a prayer. He's unable to connect to God. And why would that be? Because of what he's just committed. He's sinned. He's gone against the Christian beliefs, predominantly of the time, and also the chain of being. So again, we can look at the question. So who is Macbeth questioning? He's asking Lady Macbeth for support. Think about why people ask questions, for advice, for guidance, support, and how does she react? She's not particularly interested. These deeds must not be thought after these ways, so it will make us mad. Okay, so she shuts down his questioning of her. So that's the first bit to consider. The second bit that then develops from him saying he was unable to say amen is Macbeth begins to talk about him hearing a voice. So look, methought I heard a voice cry. So we've got this idea of hearing voices. And what does the voice cry? The voice cries, sleep no more, Macbeth does murder sleep. Okay, so he's hearing voices that say Macbeth won't sleep. Now we can look at that in a couple of ways. The use of the innocent sleep, so we've got that personification of sleep being innocent. And that's important because if Macbeth can no longer sleep, the suggestion is therefore that he is no longer innocent. We can also begin to think about as well, from a modern reading, the consideration of Macbeth's mental health and potential for post-traumatic stress disorder of what he's been through. Remember, he's returned from battle, he's returned from quite a violent war. And if we think about modern soldiers in the 2000s, which we'll come to look at when we look at the power and conflict poetry, the support that's been put in place that's available to them now after research and years of kind of more developed understanding of the traumatic kind of impact on people's mental health. One feature of post-traumatic stress disorder is hallucinations. It's inability to sleep. So we can consider potentially an element of post-traumatic stress here from Macbeth. Also, the other thing that I just want you to think about is if we link back to the witches in Act 1, Scene 3, they were talking about the captain. They referred to the captain inability to sleep. That they would stop him. So they would stop, and that's the captain of a boat, the captain of the Tiger, not the captain from Act 1 who referred to Macbeth. So they would stop him sleeping. So potentially we've got witches' involvement here too. So I just want to move on to this quote here. This is one of my favourite quotes from the play. Will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand? So here's our first reference to hand. Okay, so I'm going to highlight that, and I'm going to also highlight the use of this metaphor of Neptune. So let's just start with hands. So hands symbolically, they're the most frequently symbolised part of the human body. Okay, so Aristotle referred to them as tools of tools. Okay, they're often associated with strength, with power, with protection, and then we can also think about them being associated with generosity, stability, and hospitality. Think about the idiom to lend a hand. Obviously we have the raising of hands as well in prayer, lifting hands towards God. And we often talk about if you're bewitched an inability to pray as well, which could perhaps link back to the Amen section of earlier. So what does this mean here for Macbeth's hands? Well, his hands are physically covered in blood. So Macbeth's hands are physically covered in Duncan's blood. So we can look at it in that literal sense, and then we can start to look at it a bit more metaphorically of what does the blood, and this is what I want you guys to think about, what does the blood represent? What does the blood symbolise? It's interesting, this use of the metaphor of Neptune. So Neptune is the god of fresh water and the sea in Roman religion. So if we think about that, Macbeth's suggesting that, or he's asking, because it's a question again, so asking another question. Think about what this tells us about his type of person. So asking another question, and the question is, will all of Neptune's water clean his hands? Now we know, obviously literally it would, but metaphorically, can his hands ever be clean? I find it particularly interesting that here Macbeth, or Shakespeare chooses for Macbeth to refer to a god or another god away from the Christian religion. So the suggestion there being he's now no longer part of the Christian religion. If we link back up to the idea of he's sinned, he's gone against the Christian beliefs. And this is a particularly interesting section to look at in contrast with Lady Macbeth. When we get to her section, she talks about my hands are of your colour, but I shame to wear a heart so white. A little water clears us of these deeds. And in contrast, Macbeth seems almost stained by the blood on his hands. And this is particularly interesting. There's biblical allusions here, and I'm thinking about those of you aiming for the top grades. If we start to think about the biblical allusions of blood on hands, and we can link this to Pontius Pilate, who would help if I could spell, who was the official who presided over the trial of Jesus and his crucifixion. And you could have a little look in more detail at this, particularly, can't spell, crucifixion. There we go. And particularly in the Gospel story, so the Bible story of Good Friday, Pilate is presented as weak, as a weak man, and a man who commits evil against his better judgments. So we can make parallels here in the two stories. And so Pilate wanted to set free Jesus, but he was hounded by the Jewish council to hand him over. And then what actually happened in the story is that he washes his hands in front of the people, and he announced, "I'm innocent of this man's blood, see it for yourselves." And so perhaps you could have a look into that story a little bit more, find out a little bit more about the parallels between Macbeth and his role as I suppose somebody who commits evil, who's easily manipulated, in contrast with Pilate. So the final quote that we're going to have a look at, we're running out a bit of space down here, "To know my deed, 'twere best not know myself." So I just wanted to finish with this line. It's the penultimate line from the scene before there's a knocking, and the knocking's really important when we get to the porter, and you'll see that in tomorrow's lesson. What is he saying here? It's better to be lost in my thoughts and think about what I've become. Okay, so Macbeth, at this point, at the end of the scene, does not want to dwell on what he's done. Why? What emotions would be, I suppose, taking over him? Think about that word deed again. We've had that word deed before as a euphemism. Think about it here and how it's used. To know my deed is quite interesting. And also I want you to think about, when you watch the Lady Macbeth video next, think about how she ends the scene, how the two characters are similar, are dissimilar in their emotions, and how Shakespeare chooses to present them.